Jamari Thrash is going to take the ACC by storm in 2023. We'll talk about that, some key positional battles at the wide receiver position for the upcoming season, and depth chart predictions on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. As always, I want to thank you all again for making the Locked On Louisville podcast your first listen of the day. Just a reminder that the show is free on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. We are continuing on along into our off-season football positional preview series, now with the third installment dedicated to the wide receiver position. We'll start out by discussing why Jamari Thrash is going to take the ACC by storm this season. We'll talk about some of the key positional battles, between Coleman Jr. and Ahmari Huggins-Bruce and some other battles. We'll also talk about depth. We'll talk about the depth chart, and we will predict what the two deep will look like. So a lot of good stuff to talk about on today's episode of the show. Before we do that, I want to give a shout out, like I always do, to Kevin L1C for the arts for the Louisville Love merch, for all of your Louisville merchandising needs. Definitely hit up Kevin either on Facebook or on Twitter. A lot of great stuff to look through. So nonetheless, wide receiver positional breakdown. This has been a complete transformation over the past 6 months or so, with how new head coach Jeff Brom has been able to absolutely overturn the roster, especially at this position. There were some questions heading into the offseason, even before Scott Satterfield left. It was probably, pretty much known that Tyler Hudson was going to go to the NFL draft. But outside of that, there were some questions as to, okay, DeAndre Moore was committed at the time, but you still didn't necessarily know who was going to be added via the transfer portal, because it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that Louisville needed to add some production at the position. Well, Satterfield leaves, and those questions become even more glaring. Well, Jeff Brom and company go out and they get a bunch of transfers. Jamari Thrash from Georgia State, Kevin Coleman Jr. from Jackson State, Jimmy Calloway from Tennessee, Jadon Thompson from Cincinnati. They lost DeAndre Moore in the 2023 class, but they ended up still signing Kataris Hicks, Jalil McClain, and William Fowles. So absolutely overhauled the wide receiver room. But the main thing for me coming into the offseason was going out and finding a number one, finding a Tyler Hudson, a guy that, had some production at his previous stop, but projected to be that number one. And did Jeff Brom and company do so? They definitely did. They added Jamari Thrash from Georgia State, led the Sun Belt in receptions, receiving yards this past season, first team all-conference selection, a wide receiver that many national football analysts across the country have ranked as a player that's top 10 at the position via the transfer portal, top 20 overall, veteran guy that has shown out at the mid-major level, that people feel his skill set is directly translatable to the Power 5 level. And I think that that's something that when you look at, that's the first thing you have to discuss when it comes to this wide receiver core, is you have the number one. You have Jamari Thrash, who will be in his, I believe, redshirt senior season, if I'm not mistaken. I think he redshirted his first season at Georgia State. In 2021, had 32 catches for 451 yards, 3 touchdowns, but exploded onto the scene this past year. 61 catches, 1,122 yards, 7 touchdowns, averaged 18.4 yards per reception in his past 3 seasons with the Panthers. He averaged over 14 yards per reception. You look at the game logs from what he was able to do this season, had 5 for 53 against North Carolina, 4 for 70 against South Carolina, 10 for 213 and a touchdown against Charlotte, 4 for 130 against James Madison, who had a pretty solid defense, 10 for 167 against Marshall. So had over 130 yards receiving in all three of his final performances of the season. 4 games throughout the year he had over 100 yards. So, this is pretty much one of those situations, being 6 foot, 180 pounds. I don't necessarily think that, he is a candidate to be like a Devontae Parker jump ball winner, but he does have that second level speed, that ability to make guys miss, that home run threat ability that Louisville has sort of lacked in a vacuum since Tutu Atwell and Des Fitzpatrick left. But nonetheless, I think that Jamari Thrash is in a very, very favorable situation. I think he would be able to succeed in a Scott Satterfield offense, but I definitely think he's going to be able to explode onto the scene in the ACC for Jeff Brom's team. I think, like Jawar Jordan, I think he's going to be a guy that achieves over 1,000 yards. It's not necessarily a common thing for Louisville receivers to go for over 1,000 yards. Tyler Hudson did it last year. I think Jamari is going to do it this year for 2 reasons. Number one, the skill set's there, the translatable skill set, the opportunity is going to be there. The quarterback is in place to get him the ball, a solid offensive line to protect that quarterback. And then not to mention you have the schematic fit that helps as well. So I think that ability to that home run ability, that ability to, make guys miss in the second level of the defense, solid route runner as well, despite not having, extreme size, only being 6 feet tall, still is a guy that is going to be a matchup nightmare for ACC teams. The second reason for me is the body of work for Jeff Brom's wide receivers at Purdue. I think this is something that we can't overlook here, because you can talk about, well, Jamari Thrash, it has the talent to do so. He's going to be the number one for Louisville. He may take the ACC by storm because of the opportunity he's going to get, but also, maybe because, he obviously has the skill set as well. But there will be some concern as to, okay, well, Louisville has some mouths to feed. You have to, give Jawar Jordan, Maurice Turner, Isaac Rindo their touches, and then you have multiple other wide receivers. It's sort of a crowded wide receiver room. Nobody has really defined themselves yet on the field because we're only on June 25th. But at the same point in time, it's like, well, you have Kevin Coleman Jr., who's going to deserve some targets. Same with Ahmari Huggins-Bruce, Jimmy Calloway, Jadon Thompson, the true freshman that could come in and play. Chris Bell, the returning player from last year's team, could see some time, and I understand that. But what I will tell you is the statistics pretty much lead you to believe that the number one is going to have a very successful season, because I want to read off to you Purdue's leading receiver under Brom since 2017. 2017 was sort of the outlier year, 688 yards. Leading receiver, not good, right? Since then, the leading receiver, listen to this, 2018, 1,258 yards. 2019, 1,035 yards. 2020 was a COVID year, still had 635 yards, which is pretty substantially more impressive than 2017. 2021, 1,286 yards. 2022, 1,361 yards. So the statistics are there, and I think that this is sort of where we talk about the splits in running versus passing. I know that we talked about why this is not an air raid offense per se, but still you're going to see more passing. You're going to see more downfield shots. I thought it was very impressive to see Tyler Hudson go for over 1,000 yards with the Louisville Cardinals this past season, considering the offense he was in. But the scheme is going to be very, receiver friendly for what can translate over onto the field for Louisville. So I think that Jamari Thrash is going to be the person that gets benefited the most by this, because I think he's going to be in an offense where he is the feature guy, sort of like he was at Georgia State. It's not one of those situations to where you wonder whether or not, a skill set's going to be translatable, if he's going to be able to have sort of the same production at the previous stop, before coming to the Power 5 level. I understand that there's some concerns there, but from everyone that I've talked to, both close to the program and also from the national scene, the perception is that Jamari Thrash is going to have a Tyler Hudson-esque effect on this team to where he steps in essentially right away and is that number one receiver that this team can rely upon when they need to. So I think that that's something that, is going to lead Jamari Thrash to take the ACC by storm. You have the scheme in place to do so. You also have the player and the skill set to do so as well. So, like I mentioned, the wide receiver position got a complete overhaul. So with more studs coming into the room, there is now the question of competition. I want to talk about two key positional battles for the starting spots. That is Kevin Coleman Jr. versus Ahmari Huggins-Bruce and Jimmy Calloway versus Jadon Thompson. We're going to talk about both of those positional battles here momentarily after we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, FanDuel. Baseball season is in full swing. The All-Star break is just a couple weeks away. There's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if that first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. A lot of great opportunities from extremely solid promotionals daily to an instant withdrawal and deposit process. And also it's a safe and secure platform to use. So not a lot of ability to get hacked, which has happened to me on other platforms. So don't miss your opportunity to snag a no sweat first bet while this promo lasts. That is up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel is the official partner of Major League Baseball. Okay, so heading on into the second segment of the show, we're talking about key positional battles for the wide receiver room for the Louisville Cardinals. A lot of new faces before the 2023 season, and instinctively, speaking, there's going to be some key positional battles to start. We know Jamari Thrash is going to start. Who's going to start between the next two? That's the main question. I think that I will say this as as something before we talk about the key positional battles. I think that even if a player isn't starting, he's going to play a key role. I mean, like I said, Kevin Coleman Jr., Ahmari Huggins-Bruce, Jimmy Calloway, Jadon Thompson. I think that all three are going to play key roles. All four are going to play key roles for the Cardinals. Sorry, I have the hiccups. They're going to, have certain roles. They're going to, have significant production. This is going to be a very balanced attack. I know I predicted Jamari Thrash to have over 1,000 yards, which I do believe. I still think the other four are going to have, pretty substantial roles. The first one, if you want to consider them, the X, Y, Z or whatever in terms of receivers, we'll talk about the slot. Kevin Coleman Jr. versus Ahmari Huggins-Bruce. Kevin Coleman Jr. coming in to the Cardinals program, having caught 33 passes for 510 yards and 3 touchdowns last season for Deion Sanders' Jackson State Tigers. 5'11", St. Louis, Missouri native, was a very highly rated 4-star top 100 player coming out of the 2022 class. First team all-conference selection last season. And what I've been told multiple times is that Kevin Coleman Jr. was the most impressive wide receiver for the Cardinals in spring ball. Now, granted, this is just spring practice. Spring ball, you have to take everything with a grain of salt, but there is a ton of excitement right now generated around Kevin Coleman Jr.'s game and what he's going to be able to do at Louisville. Him and Ahmari Huggins-Bruce, pretty similar in the way that they play. They both operate well with space. You have the ability to get them the ball in a wide variety of ways, and I think that their ability to make guys miss, their ability to churn out yards after the reception is extremely solid. It's encouraging for the Cardinals moving forward. So Kevin Coleman Jr. is a guy that he's obviously, when he committed to Louisville, you thought that, okay, he's definitely going to be contending for a starting spot. Ahmari Huggins-Bruce took a step back in terms of production last year, but I do think that may have been due to the overall scheme and Louisville's injury at the quarterback position. Malik Cunningham going down really hurt the program. But last year, 31 catches for 365 yards and 2 touchdowns. I think that we're going to see the Dillon, South Carolina native sophomore, 5'10", 163 pounds. Well, actually will be a junior. I think that he's going to have a pretty significant role to where, he'll be a guy that is relied upon to get the ball in end-around situations, wide receiver screens, slants over the middle. I also think, he could be a solid deep ball threat as well. So overall, this is sort of a battle between two guys that play extremely similar. It's really just going to come down to, number one, who is going to step out and stand up in fall camp. And, who knows? We may see one player listed on the depth chart ahead of the other guy, but depending on who's the hot hand on the field, who's playing better, it's all about competition. And let me make this extremely clear. This is a fantastic problem to have if you were the Louisville Cardinals. You would rather be this way than the other way around. I can promise you that. So I think that both of these guys are going to play a ton. I wonder if there's going to be situations to where Jeff Brom, despite both of them being under 6 feet tall and your number one also being under 6 feet tall, if it would make sense to see all three on the field at the same time in certain situations. I think that could definitely be something that is looked at. And, the coaching staff says, you know what, we're just going to put a lot of dynamic playmakers on the field and worry about the fit later. And I think that is something that you definitely could end up seeing for Louisville this fall, because of those two's ability to create big-time plays seemingly out of nothing. So Kevin Coleman Jr., Ahmari Huggins-Bruce, the first and probably the number one depth chart battle that I'm looking at here as we go into fall camp. The other one is for the other receiver position outside of Thrash and the slot receiver. That is Jimmy Calloway and Jadon Thompson. Thompson coming in from Cincinnati, 6'2", 187 pounds. Caught 27 passes, 393 yards, and a touchdown this past season for Luke Fickell's team. However, he also, despite having solid size, was the kick returner for the Bearcats. So he's got that athleticism, that burst and explosiveness. So don't let the size, lead you to believe that he's sort of just a jump ball receiver, but in fact, he's pretty dynamic as well. So Jadon Thompson did miss a good portion of the spring with an injury. So we'll see if that, leads to any type of a setback, any type of a delay in getting onto the depth chart. But he's going up against another transfer, 6-foot receiver from Morrow, Georgia, Jimmy Calloway from Tennessee. This past season, only caught 2 passes for 20 yards. Didn't necessarily get a ton of opportunity for one reason or another. Had to play behind, Cedric Tillman, Jalen Hyatt, who won the Blitnikoff Award. So it's a very, very tough room to get the targets from with as much talent as the Volunteers had. But nonetheless, I do think that, Callaway had an impressive spring, had some big time catches throughout the couple months in spring ball. The same people that told me that Kevin Coleman Jr. was impressing were the same people that, told me that Jimmy Calloway had some impressive moments as well. So I think that this is going to be a situation where you have two very, very talented guys, two guys that are looking to take that next step forward that can definitely produce for your team. It's going to be a matter of, like Ahmari Huggins-Bruce and Kevin Coleman Jr.'s, position battle. Who's going to show out in fall camp? Is Jadon Thompson going to be fully healthy? I think that all signs are going to point to being yes. And then obviously you have a little bit more size with Thompson being 6'2" rather than Callaway being 6 foot. Thompson has a little bit more production, but Jimmy Calloway is also a guy that people from the Tennessee program raved about in the spring before last season, raved about in fall camp before the 2022 campaign. So it's very clear that Callaway is a talented option as well. Thompson and Callaway, it could be a battle that comes down to the final weekend before that game against Georgia Tech on Labor Day weekend. So I think that that's something to focus on here. But overall, Callaway and Thompson going to probably go head and head. We'll talk about who I think is going to get the nod heading into the first game against Georgia Tech here in the next segment. Before we do that, I want to thank you all again for making the Locked On Louisville podcast your first listen of the day. This upcoming week, we have a lot of different content. We'll have our regular positional preview series. We'll also talk about some women's basketball as that roster has pretty much been finalized. There are still some scholarship opportunities, but as of right now, it seems like the roster is almost set for next year. We're going to try to bring a couple of guests on for next week's content, but that will all be determined when we get the word. So, but to conclude the show, like we did with the quarterback position, like we did with the running back position, let's talk depth chart. We'll talk about the two deep. I already said Jamari Thrash is the number one wide receiver. We just talked about the big wide receiver battles heading into that first game against Georgia Tech. But who is going to be the starter? Dalton, who's the starter, you would say? Who are going to be the three starters? Jamari Thrash is one. I think right now, that both of these situations could be Kevin Coleman Jr. or Ahmari Huggins-Bruce and Jimmy Calloway or Jadon Thompson, which it very well may be. And I think that is going to be what's the case for the slot receiver position. I think it's going to be player X or player Y. So because I think that both of them are going to, be guys that demand, a solid amount of targets with their play on the field. If you made me pick one, I'd probably lean to Kevin Coleman Jr. very slightly. I think that, the spring that he put in place, what we saw from him last season, I do think that he would be a guy that you probably see win out that battle, in my opinion. Granted, it would not surprise me if AHB won that as well, because we've seen how dynamic he can be. But truthfully, I think it's going to be a Kevin Coleman Jr. or Ahmari Huggins-Bruce situation for that slot receiver position. For the other one, I'm going with Jadon Thompson here. I'm going to give the nod to Thompson. I know that he was injured in spring ball. I know that Jimmy Calloway had some impressive moments, but I think that Thompson, with his size, with his dynamic blend of athleticism, burst, explosiveness to go along with that 6'2" frame and strength, I think it's going to be a skill set that fits pretty well with the other personnel on the field. I think Jimmy Calloway is not far off. Like I said, I also think this could be a situation where we see a Jadon Thompson or Jimmy Calloway, but I don't think it's going to be like that on the depth chart. I do think that Jadon Thompson's going to get the start, or at least be on the number one line on the depth chart for that opening game against Georgia Tech down in Atlanta on that Friday evening before Memorial Day. I'll keep on saying Memorial Day, Labor Day. Sorry. So your starters: Jamari Thrash, Kevin Coleman Jr., and Jadon Thompson. Who's the two deep? Well, I think that obviously you can play process of elimination. The odd man out of Kevin Coleman and AHB. So for this exercise, I'll say Ahmari Huggins-Bruce along with Jimmy Calloway. Who's the other guy? I think that there's a couple different ways you can go. I think Chris Bell is probably going to get the nod from me, 6'2" receiver from Mississippi last year that played a couple of games, had a couple of catches, but I do think that his strength, his ability to make guys miss in the second level of the defense is going to, give him an opportunity. We've talked about three players that were not getting discussed enough for Louisville ahead of next season. Chris Bell was number one on my list. Granted, we have heard through the grapevine that there's possibility that we see Chris Bell line up at tight end, which I think makes things very interesting. So that's something that we have to pay attention to moving into fall camp and seeing that. But I think that if it's not Chris Bell, I'm going to go with William Fowles, 4-star receiver out of the Miami area who, being a little bit taller, 6'3", a guy that really, really impressed at the Under Armour All-American camp this past winter, a player that looked very, very good against the nation's top defensive backs in the 2023 class. So I think William Fowles is a guy that's going to see some opportunities. Now, how much, that is yet to be seen. Obviously, injuries happen, so you have some depth there. But I think the true freshmen could all potentially be redshirt candidates. I think that Kataris Hicks was a guy in spring that many, kind of pinpointed as a player that is sort of outplaying the perception of how we thought he would play. And Kataris Hicks looked very, very solid one-on-one situations in the spring. It'll be interesting to see off-season. I know Jaleel McClain was not an early enrollee, the 3-star / 4-star athlete from St. John Bosco out in California, came here from the Flyville or Cali to the Ville momentum. So I think that depth chart wise, for me, you're looking at the starters. If you made me pick the starters and not do like or situations, it's Jamari Thrash, Kevin Coleman Jr., and Jadon Thompson on the 1 line, Chris Bell, Ahmari Huggins-Bruce, and Jimmy Calloway on the 2 line, and William Fowles, Kataris Hicks, Jaleel McClain sort of on the outside looking in. Allen Houston and Elijah Downing, 2 walk-ons, could also maybe be in the situation depending on injuries, depending on how they do in fall camp. So we will see. But the wide receiver position was completely overhauled, and I'm extremely excited to see what or how the group will do in that first game against Georgia Tech. But that's going to wrap up today's episode of the show. To find the Locked On Louisville podcast on all streaming services, stay tuned to the graphic.